A routine permit denial by county officials would spark a chain of events that transformed a struggling widow's farm into what Pentagon officials now call an accidental revolution in agricultural sustainability, all triggered by one woman's stubborn refusal to give up her family's century-old farming practices, a stance that would lead to military aircraft landing in her cornfield and eventually reshape national food security policy. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and if this story resonates with you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something even more extraordinary for you. The summer drought had cracked the soil of Willow Creek Farm into a jigsaw puzzle of parched earth. Sarah Keller stood at the edge of her cornfield, the morning sun already beating down with unforgiving intensity despite the early hour. Her weathered hands shielded her eyes as she surveyed the struggling crop, rows of corn that should have been shoulder-high by now barely reaching her waist. At 52, the creases around her eyes had deepened considerably in the 18 months since her husband's passing, each line a testament to both grief and determination that had become her constant companions. The stack of papers crushed. In her back pocket seemed to burn against her skin, the county's official denial of her modernization permit, delivered yesterday afternoon by a sympathetic clerk who couldn't quite meet her eyes. The rejection cited insufficient water rights allocation and unsubstantiated methodological approach, bureaucratic language that translated simply to give up. The farm's irrigation system, patched and repaired for 30 years, had finally surrendered to entropy 3 weeks ago, leaving the crops increasingly desperate in the merciless heat. Sarah pulled the crumpled bank statement from her front pocket and unfolded it again, though the numbers hadn't changed since she'd checked it at dawn. The balance couldn't possibly cover the specialized equipment needed to implement the alternative irrigation design she'd spent months developing. A system that would have reduced water usage by 65% while increasing soil moisture retention through techniques she'd studied decades ago in college. 2 more weeks without proper water and we lose everything, she muttered to no one but the struggling cornstalks around her. A red-winged blackbird perched on a nearby fence post seemed to regard her with curious sympathy, tilting its head, as if considering her predicament. "Don't suppose you've got any solutions?" she asked the bird, which responded by launching itself skyward, disappearing into the cloudless blue that promised no relief. When Thomas had died of a sudden heart attack in the barn 18 months ago, he'd left Sarah with more than just grief. The farm carried substantial debt from 3 consecutive years of poor harvests, the result of increasingly unpredictable weather patterns and falling commodity prices. The loan extensions and refinancing options had all been exhausted 6 months earlier, leaving Sarah in a financial freefall, cushioned only by her relentless work ethic and ingenuity. The conventional wisdom in Prairie Junction, Nebraska, repeated with increasing frequency at the feed and grain, the diner, and after Sunday services was that Willow Creek Farm would soon join the growing list of family operations sold to Heartland Agricultural Enterprises. The corporate giant had methodically acquired 17 family farms in the county over the past 5 years, their identical green and gold signs replacing generations of family names along county roads. Richard Tanner, Heartland's regional acquisition manager, had visited 3 times in the past year, each offer slightly higher but still insultingly below the property's true value. His last visit 2 weeks ago had ended with what he clearly believed was a compelling argument. "You're fighting a losing battle against nature, economics and progress, Mrs. Keller. Heartland has the resources to make this land productive again. You don't. It's that simple." What Tanner and his corporate algorithms couldn't calculate was the stubborn determination that had kept Sarah going when grief alone might have crushed her. She had defied expectations and projections for 18 months through a combination of unconventional approaches drawn from her background in agricultural science a career she'd set aside 25 years earlier when she married Thomas and moved to the farm. Her grandfather had been a professor of soil science, and she'd grown up learning about agricultural systems that predated the chemical-intensive methods that now dominated American farming. Her approaches had raised eyebrows and generated whispers. At the local co-op, the companion planting strategies that reduced pest control costs. The experimental soil treatments using fermentation processes she'd developed in her barn. The careful water management that had stretched her limited irrigation further than anyone believed possible. And now, her rejected irrigation system design that the county officials had dismissed without proper review, suggesting instead that she consider realistic options for the property. The subtext had been clear in every interaction with county officials over the past year. A widow with unorthodox methods didn't fit their vision of modern agriculture, especially when a powerful corporation was interested in acquiring the land. Prairie Junction needed the tax revenue and jobs that Heartland promised, not the headaches of supporting struggling family operations with unconventional practices. Sarah walked the perimeter of her eastern field, mentally calculating how long she could extend her remaining water reserves using even stricter rationing. Perhaps she could sacrifice the western section entirely, concentrating all resources on the eastern fields where the soil composition responded better to her treatments. It might salvage enough yield to cover the property taxes at least, though loan payments would remain impossible. The early morning quiet was suddenly shattered by the distinctive sound of aircraft engines, unusual in this remote corner of the county where even commercial flight paths rarely crossed. Looking up, she was startled to see a military plane circling overhead, far lower than typical flight paths would dictate. The aircraft's distinctive profile was immediately recognizable even to her civilian eye. A reconnaissance plane of some kind, its wings bristling with sensors and equipment that caught the morning sunlight. "What in the world?" she murmured, shielding her eyes against the sun as the aircraft began a second circle above her property. Military activity was rare in this region. The nearest Air Force base was over 300 miles away in South Dakota, yet the distinctive markings were unmistakable. This was undoubtedly an Air Force plane, and it appeared to be specifically surveying Willow Creek Farm. Sarah's confusion deepened as the plane completed a third circle directly above her property, before banking away toward the west. The deliberate pattern couldn't be coincidental. The aircraft had focused exclusively on her farm, ignoring the Hendersons' property to the north and the newly acquired Heartland fields to the south. She remained frozen in place, trying to make sense of the bizarre interlude until the sound of engines faded completely. Only then did she notice a black SUV with government plates turning onto her long gravel driveway from the county road, dust billowing behind it as it approached at a measured pace. The vehicle's official appearance and perfect timing in relation to the aircraft's departure suggested coordination rather than coincidence, pushing her confusion toward concern. Instinctively, Sarah squared her shoulders and started walking toward the house, her stride purposeful despite the anxiety building in her chest. Whatever this unusual visitation meant, she would face it with the same resilience that had carried her through the past 18 months of challenges. She couldn't possibly know that by sunset everything would change, that the permit denial that seemed like her final defeat would instead become the catalyst for extraordinary events, beginning with that unexpected aircraft surveying her failing. Cornfields. Inside the approaching government vehicle, Major Rebecca Chen reviewed satellite imagery on her tablet one final time. The thermal and spectral anomalies detected over this particular farm had triggered alerts in 3 different military research divisions simultaneously. The preliminary analysis had been compelling enough to dispatch a specialized reconnaissance aircraft for confirmation using advanced sensors that could detect subtle biochemical signatures impossible to identify from satellite altitude. The results had exceeded expectations, showing patterns of cellular resilience and soil microbial activity that contradicted everything they understood about drought response in conventional agriculture. Whatever Sarah Keller was doing with her supposedly failing crops represented exactly what the Sustainable Resources Division had been searching for during the past 8 years of increasingly urgent climate adaptation research. They just hadn't expected to find it on a widow's drought-stricken farm in Nebraska. Major Chen had insisted on making initial contact personally, rather than sending the standard assessment team. 20 years in military research had taught her that the human element often explained anomalies more effectively than technical analysis alone. The preliminary background report on Sarah Keller suggested someone with unconventional knowledge, applying techniques that might bridge traditional wisdom with modern science, an approach the division had theorized but never successfully implemented. The SUV came to a stop in the farmyard, dust settling around it in the still morning air. Through the windshield, Major Chen observed Sarah Keller approaching from the fields, a woman whose determined stride belied the financial distress detailed. In the background briefing, Chen had reviewed county records showing the permit denial, bank documents indicating imminent foreclosure, and satellite imagery revealing crops that somehow defied both. Sarah reached her front porch just as Major Chen emerged from the vehicle. The contrast between them seemed to perfectly symbolize the imbalance of the moment. Sarah, in faded work clothes, bearing the stains of manual labor, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, facing a uniformed military officer, whose pristine appearance and official vehicle represented institutional authority. "Mrs. Keller?" Major Chen removed her sunglasses, her posture military precise despite her attempt at casual approachability. "I'm Major Rebecca Chen, United States Air Force Sustainable Resources Division. I was hoping we might discuss your farming methods, particularly that experimental soil treatment you've been developing in your barn." The specific reference to her private work sent a chill through Sarah. No one outside the farm knew about those experiments, not the neighbors who kept a polite distance since Thomas's death, not the county officials who barely examined her permit application, not even her sister in Omaha who called every Sunday with well-meaning advice about moving on. She had told absolutely no one about the fermentation system that had begun as a desperate attempt to extend her limited fertilizer budget and evolved into something she herself didn't fully understand. "I'm not sure what you're talking about," Sarah replied cautiously, crossing her arms. The military's unexpected appearance on her property, particularly following the aerial survey, triggered deep instincts of protectiveness. "And I'm not sure why the Air Force would have any interest in a failing farm the county won't even issue permits for." Major Chen smiled slightly, recognizing the natural skepticism. "Mrs. Keller, satellite imagery doesn't lie. Whatever you've been adding to your soil creates a distinctive thermal and biological signature unlike anything we've documented before. Your corn shouldn't be surviving this drought at all, let alone showing the cellular resilience our imagery has detected. We've been monitoring unusual agricultural developments nationwide, and your farm is registering patterns that, frankly, shouldn't be possible." Sarah's mind raced, calculating possibilities and implications. The fermentation system had started. Simply kitchen scraps, particular wild fungi she'd studied in college, and a combination of minerals from the creek bed that had shown promising results in small tests. Her grandfather had taught her about traditional fermentation methods used by farmers before chemical fertilizers became standard, combined with soil microbiome principles that mainstream agriculture had largely abandoned. She had expanded gradually, converting half the barn into what Thomas would have jokingly called her witch's brewery. The process had evolved through careful observation and adjustment rather than formal scientific method, guided by knowledge passed down from her grandfather and her own agricultural science background. The results had been better than expected. Crops that showed remarkable drought resistance and soil that retained moisture far longer than it should. "The county just denied my permit application yesterday," Sarah said, still processing the surreal turn of events. "They called my methods unsubstantiated and basically told me to sell to Heartland. Now you're telling me the Air Force has been watching my farm from space?" "Not specifically your farm, Mrs. Keller," Major Chen clarified, recognizing the understandable alarm in Sarah's voice. "We monitor agricultural anomalies nationally as part of food security protocols. Climate change has made this a matter of national security as traditional growing regions face increasing challenges. Your property triggered automated alerts 3 weeks ago when drought conditions intensified throughout the region, yet your crops continued showing unusual resilience patterns." Chen gestured toward the barn visible beyond the house. "Would you be willing to show me what you've been working on, unofficially for now?" The qualifier, unofficially, raised immediate questions that Sarah didn't hesitate to voice. "And officially?" "Officially, a research team will arrive tomorrow morning. By transport plane, landing in your east field where there's sufficient clear space." Major Chen's direct gaze conveyed the significance. "What you've developed appears to have significant implications for agricultural sustainability in drought conditions, potentially important enough to classify as a matter of national security. But I'd prefer to see it firsthand before the full team arrives." Sarah stared at the Major, the magnitude of what was happening slowly sinking in. Yesterday, county officials had dismissed her as a stubborn widow with impractical ideas, refusing her permit application with barely concealed condescension. Today, the Air Force was preparing to land a transport plane on her property to investigate those same ideas. The absurdity almost made her laugh, despite the tension knotting her shoulders. "I was just trying to save my farm," she said quietly, more to herself than to Major Chen. "Thomas always said necessity makes the best innovator." Chen nodded with unexpected understanding. The most significant discoveries often come from exactly that place, necessity rather than theory. "Would you be willing to show me your work, Mrs. Keller?" After a moment's hesitation, Sarah nodded and led the way toward the barn. Whatever happened next, the county's permit denial had suddenly become the least of her concerns. As they walked across the parched farmyard, she couldn't possibly know that by this time tomorrow, military aircraft would indeed be landing in her cornfield, beginning a chain of events that would eventually transform not just Willow Creek Farm, but agricultural policy nationwide. The barn's weathered red exterior gave no indication of its contents. Thomas had maintained the structure meticulously during his life, replacing roof sections and reinforcing walls as needed. The building had been constructed by his grandfather in 1924, built to withstand the prairie storms that occasionally swept through with destructive force. Its solidity had provided Sarah with both practical space and emotional comfort during the difficult months following her husband's death. "My grandfather was an agricultural science professor at the State University," Sarah explained as they approached. "He studied traditional farming methods from around the world, techniques that worked for centuries before industrial agriculture took over. When modern fertilizers and pesticides became too expensive after Thomas died, I started experimenting with some of his ideas out of necessity." "Your grandfather's name was Edward Harrington, correct?" Major Chen asked, referencing information that Sarah had never shared with her. "He published several papers on soil microbiology in the 1960s that were largely dismissed at the time, but have gained renewed attention in certain research circles." Sarah stopped abruptly, turning to face the Major with increased wariness. "How do you know about my grandfather's work?" Those papers were rejected by mainstream agricultural journals and only published in obscure academic periodicals. Mrs. Keller, the military has been researching sustainable agriculture applications for decades, particularly as climate change threatens food security. Your grandfather's work on soil regeneration and drought resistance was well ahead of its time. It was dismissed primarily because it challenged the chemical-intensive approaches that dominated post-war agricultural policy. The revelation that her grandfather's rejected research had been monitored by military scientists added another layer of surrealism to the morning's events. Sarah had grown up hearing him lament how his approaches were considered impractical or unnecessarily complex, compared to the simplicity of chemical solutions flooding the market after World War II. The possibility that his work had been valued, even secretly, by government researchers all along created a bittersweet validation she wished he had lived to witness. The barn door creaked as Sarah pulled it open, revealing an improvised laboratory that represented 18 months of desperate innovation fueled by grief, determination, and scientific knowledge that had found unexpected purpose. The interior bore little resemblance to a traditional barn. The eastern half still contained hay bales, tools, and farm equipment. But the western section had been transformed into an orderly research space with workbenches, fermentation vessels of various sizes, and careful documentation taped to the walls. 5 large containers dominated the central area, each a modified stock tank containing different stages of what Sarah called her soil probiotic. The earthy, slightly sweet smell that filled the space came from the complex fermentation process that combined organic matter, specific fungi, minerals, and bacterial cultures in carefully maintained ratios. Handwritten notebooks filled several shelves documenting each iteration and result since she had begun experimenting. Major Chen's sharp intake of breath confirmed what Sarah had begun to suspect. Her makeshift solution to an immediate crisis had accidentally stumbled upon something far more significant than saving a single farm in Nebraska. The Major moved methodically through the space, examining the setup with the practiced eye of someone familiar with advanced research facilities while still appreciating the ingenuity of Sarah's improvised approach. "You developed all of this independently?" Chen asked, examining the detailed charts tracking soil moisture, microbial activity, and crop response following various treatment applications. Sarah nodded, watching carefully as the military officer photographed certain elements with her phone. "I started with my grandfather's basic formulations and adapted them based on our specific soil conditions and available materials. It was supposed to be a temporary measure until I could afford commercial fertilizers again, but the results were better than I expected." "Better is an understatement, Mrs. Keller. Your eastern field shows microbial diversity and soil structure that agricultural scientists have been trying to achieve for decades. The drought resistance mechanisms your crops are demonstrating shouldn't be possible with current technology." Major Chen gestured toward the handwritten notebooks. "Your documentation methods are impressively thorough for someone working alone. My grandfather always said good science requires good record keeping, even when you're the only one who'll ever see the results." Sarah pulled down one of the notebooks, opening to a page where she'd taped soil sample photographs alongside microscope images of microbial activity. "I still have his old microscope. It's not fancy, but it lets me monitor what's happening at a basic level." Chen examined the images with visible interest. These microbial communities resemble patterns our research teams have been trying to cultivate in laboratory conditions without sustainable success. You've achieved them in actual field conditions using primarily local materials and knowledge-intensive, rather than resource-intensive methods. The validation from someone with obvious scientific understanding created a complex emotional response in Sarah, pride in what she'd accomplished mixed with frustration that county officials had dismissed her approaches without serious consideration. Try explaining that to the county agricultural board. They wouldn't even look at my documentation before rejecting the permit application. Bureaucratic short-sightedness is unfortunately common when innovations come from unexpected sources. Chen replied with a hint of sympathy beneath her professional demeanor, but in this case, their rejection might have inadvertently done you a favor. How could denying essential irrigation improvements possibly help me? Sarah asked, the practical reality of her situation reasserting itself despite the unexpected military interest. Because it brought your work to our attention, before Heartland Agricultural Enterprises could acquire your property and bury your innovations, Major Chen said bluntly. Our surveillance systems flagged unusual crop performance patterns during routine monitoring. The same satellite data that revealed your farm's exceptional drought resistance also showed Heartland actively purchasing properties surrounding yours despite their supposedly poor performance. That pattern suggests they may have recognized what you've developed, even if county officials didn't. The implication landed with disturbing clarity. Sarah had assumed Heartland's interest stemmed simply from their systematic regional expansion rather than specific knowledge of her soil treatments. You think Heartland knows about my work? How would they even detect it? Agribusiness corporations employ sophisticated monitoring technologies to identify acquisition targets. Heartland specifically has invested heavily in spectral analysis. Technologies that can detect soil health indicators from aerial surveys. Their research division has been attempting to develop proprietary soil amendments similar to what you appear to have created independently. This revelation cast Richard Tanner's increasingly persistent visits in an entirely new light. His dismissive attitude toward her farming methods had seemed merely condescending. Now it appeared potentially calculated to devalue her work while still acquiring its benefits through property purchase. If what you've developed works at scale, Mrs. Keller, it represents a potential paradigm shift in drought-resistant agriculture using regenerative methods rather than chemical interventions. Major Chen continued, the national security implications for food production in changing climate conditions are significant enough to warrant immediate protective measures for both you and your intellectual property. Sarah looked around the barn, her improvised laboratory created from necessity rather than ambition, with new perspective. The fermentation system she'd developed to stretch limited resources suddenly represented something with implications extending far beyond Willow Creek Farm. In attempting merely to survive financially, she had apparently stumbled upon something that powerful interests recognized as valuable enough to acquire by any means necessary. What exactly happens tomorrow when your team arrives? Sarah asked, the reality of military aircraft landing in her cornfield still seeming more like fiction than imminent fact. A preliminary research assessment team will document your methods, collect soil samples for comprehensive analysis, and establish baseline measurements for comprehensive evaluation, Major Chen explained. Simultaneously, a legal team will provide options for protecting your intellectual property development rights while ensuring national security interests. Sarah's practical nature reasserted itself despite the overwhelming developments. And my farm. The bank isn't going to stop foreclosure proceedings because the military finds my soil interesting. Major Chen's expression suggested this practical concern had already been anticipated. The Sustainable Resources Division has emergency funding authorization for agricultural innovations with national security applications. By tomorrow afternoon, your immediate financial concerns will be addressed through development contract mechanisms that preserve your ownership while providing necessary operational resources. The comprehensive response to concerns Sarah hadn't Even fully articulated, suggested this wasn't the first time the military had encountered valuable innovations at risk of being lost to financial pressure or corporate acquisition. The systematic approach indicated established protocols for exactly this type of situation, discovering and protecting agricultural developments with national security implications. As they exited the barn into the harsh sunlight, Sarah found herself at a crossroads she couldn't have imagined when she received the permit denial just 24 hours earlier. The county's rejection that had seemed like the final blow to her struggling operation had inadvertently set in motion events that might not only save her farm, but potentially transform agricultural practices facing increasingly challenging climate conditions. Major Chen paused before returning to her vehicle. "Mrs. Keller, I recommend you don't discuss this visit with anyone before our team arrives tomorrow, particularly not with any Heartland representatives who might contact you." The warning's implication was clear. Corporate interests might take extraordinary measures to acquire valuable intellectual property if they recognized its significance. Sarah nodded her understanding, the surreal quality of the morning's events still not fully processed. As the black SUV disappeared down the long driveway, Sarah stood in her farmyard, the crumpled permit denial still in her pocket, and the memory of Major Chen's revelations reshaping everything she thought she understood about her situation. Yesterday, county officials had dismissed her as a stubborn widow with impractical ideas. Today, military researchers had identified those same ideas as potentially revolutionary. She turned to look at her struggling cornfields, seeing them now through different eyes, not as evidence of failure, but as testament to unexpected success against impossible odds. Tomorrow, military aircraft would land on her property, beginning a chain of events that would transform not just Willow Creek Farm, but potentially agricultural practices nationwide. The red-winged blackbird returned, landing on the same fence. Posters earlier, its distinctive call seeming almost congratulatory in the midday quiet. "Didn't see that coming, did you?" Sarah said to the bird, with the first genuine smile that had crossed her face in months. The bird tilted its head as if considering her changed circumstances before once again taking flight, this time against gathering clouds that hinted at long-absent rain finally approaching from the western horizon. Sarah Keller barely slept that night. The events of the day had transformed her world so completely that restful sleep seemed impossible. She alternated between reviewing her meticulous research notes and staring out the farmhouse window at the stars, wondering how her desperate attempts to save her family's legacy had attracted military attention. The first hints of dawn found her at the kitchen table, on her third cup of coffee, her grandfather's original research journals spread before her, their yellowed pages filled with handwritten observations that mainstream agriculture had once dismissed as irrelevant. The phone rang at precisely 6 a.m., startling her despite her wakefulness. The caller ID showed unknown number, which Sarah now understood might indicate official government communication rather than the usual telemarketers she ignored. "Mrs. Keller, this is Major Chen. Our team will arrive at approximately 0800 hours. We've coordinated with regional air traffic control to secure temporary restricted airspace over your property. You may notice additional vehicles establishing perimeter security beginning shortly. Please maintain normal activities but avoid the eastern field where landing will occur." The clinical precision of the instructions emphasized the extraordinary shift in Sarah's circumstances. 24 hours earlier, her most pressing concern had been stretching her meager water supply to salvage a partial harvest. Now, military aircraft were preparing to land on her property while security teams established perimeters. "How many people should I expect?" Sarah asked, her practical nature focusing on concrete details rather than the overwhelming implications. The core assessment team includes 8 specialists plus support personnel. Initial security placement will involve 12 additional staff. I understand this represents significant disruption to your routine, Mrs. Keller, but I assure you every effort will be made to minimize interference with essential farm operations. After ending the call, Sarah changed into clean work clothes, not her best, but free from the dirt and stains that accompanied daily farm labor. She refused to present herself as anything other than what she was, a farmer who had applied practical knowledge to survive impossible circumstances, but some remnant of pride demanded at least this minor concession to the extraordinary visitation. From the porch, coffee mug in hand, she watched the promised security vehicles arrive. Unlike the dramatic black SUVs of television shows, these were ordinary-looking white vans and pickup trucks that would attract minimal attention from passing traffic or curious neighbors. The personnel who emerged wore civilian clothing rather than uniforms, their military bearing nevertheless evident in their movements and positioning as they established observation points at the property boundaries. At 7:45 a.m., Sarah heard the aircraft before seeing it, a deep mechanical thrum, growing steadily louder until the transport plane appeared from the west, larger than she had imagined, and descending with deliberate precision toward her farm. The C-130 Hercules, she recognized the model from news coverage of humanitarian missions, circled once before aligning with her eastern field, its massive form seeming impossible against the rural Nebraska landscape. The landing was surprisingly gentle, the skilled pilot bringing the substantial aircraft down on the makeshift runway of hard-packed soil with minimal disruption. Dust billowed around the plane as it came to a stop at the field's northern edge, its engines winding down with a diminishing whine that left an almost eerie silence in its wake. From her vantage point near the barn, Sarah watched as the rear cargo ramp lowered and vehicles began emerging. 2 military Humvees, a large equipment truck, and what appeared to be a mobile laboratory unit. Personnel disembarked in organized fashion, establishing an operational area with practiced efficiency that suggested frequent deployment in unconventional settings. Major Chen approached from the direction of the security perimeter, her uniform now formal rather than the more casual attire of the previous day. Beside her walked a tall man with silver hair and the confidence of someone accustomed to command. His uniform, bearing insignia Sarah didn't recognize but instinctively understood, indicated significant rank. Mrs. Keller, thank you for your cooperation. During this unusual process, Major Chen began, allow me to introduce Colonel James Harrington, Director of the Sustainable Resources Division, who has personally overseen our rapid response to your situation. The Colonel extended his hand, his grip firm but not dominating. Mrs. Keller, your work has attracted considerable interest at the highest levels. I apologize for the dramatic entrance, but your situation presented both extraordinary opportunity and concerning vulnerability that warranted immediate response. Sarah met his gaze directly, determined to maintain her dignity despite feeling desperately out of her depth. Your timing is certainly interesting, Colonel. The county rejects my permit one day, and the Air Force lands in my field the next. Makes me wonder who else might be watching my little farm. A subtle smile crossed the Colonel's face, suggesting appreciation for her directness. You've identified exactly why we're here, Mrs. Keller. What you've developed has attracted multiple interested parties, not all with intentions that would honor your work or serve the public good. Perhaps we could discuss the details somewhere more comfortable than your field. They settled in Sarah's kitchen, a space that had once hosted neighborhood potlucks during Thomas's life, but had seldom seen visitors since his death. The contrast between the military officers in their pristine uniforms and the humble farmhouse interior with its 1970s cabinets and well-worn furnishings emphasized the unlikely convergence of worlds taking place. Colonel Harrington placed a secure tablet on the table and activated a presentation that immediately caught Sarah's attention. The screen displayed satellite imagery of her farm alongside thermal and spectral analysis that transformed the familiar landscape into colorful patterns indicating biological activity and soil composition. Mrs. Keller, our atmospheric monitoring systems detected unusual biochemical signatures above your property approximately 3 weeks ago. Initial analysis suggested intensive agricultural activity inconsistent with reported drought conditions. Further investigation revealed microbial soil activity and plant cellular responses that contradict established limitations of current agricultural technology. He advanced to the next screen, which displayed remarkable differences between her fields and neighboring properties. Your eastern field demonstrates biological resilience mechanisms that exceed anything in our current agricultural database. The neighboring Heartland property, despite their advanced irrigation and chemical treatments, shows significantly inferior drought adaptation and soil biology. Sarah studied the images with growing understanding. Her improvised system, born from desperate necessity and her grandfather's rejected research, was producing results that sophisticated monitoring systems identified as extraordinary. "I was just trying to keep the farm alive," she said quietly. "Thomas's family has worked this land for 4 generations. I couldn't bear to lose it, especially to corporate acquisition." Colonel Harrington nodded, his expression suggesting deeper understanding than she had expected. Necessity often drives innovation beyond what structured research programs achieve. Your grandfather understood this principle. His research on regenerative soil systems was decades ahead of its time. 2. Threatening to the chemical agricultural paradigm being established during his career to gain proper recognition. The reference to her grandfather's work brought Sarah's focus sharply back to the colonel. "How do you know about my grandfather's research? Major Chen mentioned it yesterday, but his work was rejected by mainstream agricultural journals and largely forgotten." A significant glance passed between the colonel and Major Chen before he responded. "Mrs. Keller, what I'm about to share requires security clearance that we've temporarily extended to you given your essential role in this development. Your grandfather, Edward Harrington, submitted his research on regenerative soil systems to the Department of Agriculture in 1962, where it was indeed rejected by conventional review processes. However, certain elements of his work were flagged by an officer who recognized potential applications beyond conventional agriculture." The colonel advanced to another screen, showing scanned documents bearing classification markings and her grandfather's distinctive handwriting. "Your grandfather's research was subsequently incorporated into a classified program, examining sustainable food production methods for military installations in adverse conditions. While official agricultural policy continued promoting chemical-intensive approaches for civilian applications, his regenerative methods were quietly developed within specialized military research divisions. Sarah stared at the documents, recognizing her grandfather's work, presented in context she'd never imagined. The implications were staggering. Research publicly dismissed had been secretly valued and developed by military scientists for decades. "He never knew," she said with quiet certainty. "He died believing his life's work had been rejected as worthless." "Unfortunately correct," Colonel Harrington confirmed with evident regret. Security protocols during that era prevented acknowledging civilian contributions to classified research. By the time classification restrictions relaxed in the 1990s, your grandfather had passed away, and program administrators incorrectly assumed the civilian research line had ended without further development. Major Chen picked up the narrative. "What makes your work so significant, Mrs. Keller, is that you've independently extended your grandfather's research in directions our classified programs never explored, applying his principles to broader agricultural challenges rather than the specialized military applications that became our focus. You've essentially completed the civilian research path that institutional barriers interrupted decades ago. The revelation created complex emotions for Sarah. Pride in continuing her grandfather's legacy unknowingly, anger at the institutional systems that had dismissed his work publicly while exploiting it privately, and growing recognition that her improvised solutions might represent something far more significant than she had realized. Colonel Harrington continued with practiced precision. Our immediate concern involves protecting both you and your intellectual property from multiple entities who have demonstrated interest in acquisition through various means. Heartland Agricultural Enterprises represents the most immediate concern, but foreign interests have also initiated intelligence collection activities targeting unconventional agricultural innovations. This introduced another layer of complexity Sarah hadn't considered. Foreign interests? I'm just a farmer in Nebraska trying to keep my corn alive during a drought. How could that possibly attract international attention? Major Chen explained, with the measured tone of someone accustomed to communicating complex security concerns to civilians. Global climate change has transformed food security into critical national security infrastructure. Nations facing severe agricultural challenges due to changing climate patterns have established aggressive intelligence collection targeting emerging technologies that might provide adaptation advantages. Drought-resistant agricultural methods that don't require expensive technological infrastructure represent particularly high-value targets. The colonel advanced to another screen, showing surveillance photographs of individuals Sarah recognized with shock. Richard Tanner, Heartland's acquisition manager, meeting with people identified in caption text as foreign nationals associated with agricultural intelligence collection. Heartland's interest in your property extends beyond simple corporate expansion. Their technical analysis identified your soil amendment system's potential value to their international partners, who face severe drought conditions that threaten political stability. Sarah's mind struggled to process the escalating implications. Her desperate attempts to save her family farm had apparently stumbled upon agricultural innovations with international security implications involving corporate espionage and foreign intelligence operations. The scenario seemed more appropriate for a political thriller than her reality as a widowed farmer in rural Nebraska. 3 days ago, our surveillance systems detected Heartland deploying advanced soil analysis equipment at properties adjoining yours, Major Chen continued. Yesterday's county permit denial following minimal review suggests potential interference in normal bureaucratic processes to increase financial pressure on your operation, accelerating potential acquisition. Colonel Harrington's expression turned grave. Mrs. Keller, I'll be direct. Your work represents potentially transformative agricultural methodology that certain interests would prefer to control exclusively rather than see developed for broader benefit. The research team outside is conducting comprehensive documentation and analysis to establish baseline protection for your intellectual property, while our security personnel ensure your immediate safety. From the kitchen window, Sarah could see the research team methodically collecting soil samples and documenting her barn laboratory with sophisticated equipment. The scene reinforced the extraordinary reality shift occurring. Her improvised experiments now subject to advanced scientific analysis by military researchers. What exactly happens now? Sarah asked, the practical question grounding her amid increasingly abstract geopolitical concerns. Colonel Harrington activated another screen on his tablet, displaying official documentation with Department of Defense. Headers. We're proposing an immediate research partnership through the Sustainable Resources Division's Agricultural Adaptation Program. This would provide comprehensive intellectual property protection, immediate financial resources stabilizing your farm operations, and research support, expanding your soil amendment system for broader applications. He slid the tablet toward her, the screen displaying specific numbers that momentarily took Sarah's breath away. The proposed research stipend alone would eliminate her outstanding debt and operational deficits, while the implementation funding would transform her improvised barn laboratory into a properly equipped research facility. Additional provisions addressed water rights issues that would effectively overrule the county's permit denial through federal preemption. All this because of some fermented soil treatment I developed in my barn. The disconnect between her desperate improvisation and the extraordinary response it had triggered remained difficult to reconcile. "Mrs. Keller," Colonel Harrington replied with unexpected earnestness, "what you've developed represents exactly the kind of regenerative agricultural approach needed for climate adaptation nationwide. Your methodology combines traditional knowledge with modern understanding in ways institutional research has repeatedly failed to achieve. The value extends far beyond financial metrics to fundamental food security resilience in changing environmental conditions." As Sarah considered the proposal, a security team member entered the kitchen with urgent purpose, speaking quietly to Major Chen, whose expression immediately sharpened. After a brief exchange, Chen turned to Colonel Harrington. "Sir, surveillance has detected Heartland representatives approaching the property perimeter. Mr. Tanner plus 3 individuals identified as their technical assessment team. They're requesting access to speak with Mrs. Keller regarding an urgent acquisition offer." The timing couldn't be coincidental. Something had alerted Heartland to the unusual activity at Willow Creek Farm, accelerating their acquisition attempts. In response to potential competition, Sarah felt a surge of both anxiety and indignation. The corporation that had dismissed her farming approach while secretly recognizing its value now rushed to secure what military interest had exposed as valuable. Colonel Harrington turned to Sarah with calm authority. "This development is unsurprising, but requires immediate decision regarding your preferred response. Our security perimeter will prevent unauthorized access, but Heartland representatives are legally entitled to approach your property with business proposals unless you explicitly deny permission." The simple farmer who had awakened yesterday to crushing permit denial now found herself at the center of competing interests from powerful organizations, each recognizing value in work that local agricultural officials had dismissed without serious consideration. The absurdity might have been amusing if the stakes weren't so significant for both her personal future and the potential broader implications of her agricultural innovations. "I'd like to hear what they're offering," Sarah decided after a moment's reflection. "Not because I'm considering their proposal, but because understanding their approach might reveal exactly what they believe they've identified in my work." Colonel Harrington nodded with subtle approval. "A strategically sound approach. Major Chen will remain present as your security advisor if that's acceptable. Their response to military presence may itself reveal useful information about their true intentions and awareness of your work's significance." 20 minutes later, Richard Tanner's carefully maintained professional facade showed visible cracks as he sat across from Sarah at her kitchen table, his eyes repeatedly darting to Major Chen's uniformed presence with poorly concealed concern. The 3 technical specialists he had brought remained outside, prevented from accessing the property by the security perimeter that now surrounded Willow Creek Farm. "Mrs. Keller, our company has conducted further review of your property and recognized unique value characteristics warranting immediate revised acquisition offer," Tanner began, his practiced corporate rhetoric strained by obvious tension. "Heartland is prepared to offer 3 times our previous proposal, with immediate cash transaction and expedited closing to accommodate your needs." The dramatic increase without specific justification confirmed everything Colonel Harrington had suggested about Heartland's true interest in her farm. Sarah kept her expression neutral, despite the vindication she felt. "That's a substantial increase from an offer you assured me 2 weeks ago was maximum market value based on comprehensive assessment. What specifically has changed in your evaluation?" Tanner's eyes again flickered to Major Chen, whose silent presence clearly disrupted his prepared approach. "Our agronomists identified potential soil characteristics suggesting untapped productivity potential under proper management systems. Heartland values innovation and recognizes your contributions to sustainable practices." The sudden acknowledgement of sustainable practices he had previously dismissed as impractical sentimentality revealed just how much Heartland's internal assessment contradicted their public positioning. They had recognized the value of her soil amendment system while publicly maintaining it represented outdated methodology that couldn't compete with industrial approaches. "Mr. Tanner, your timing is interesting," Sarah observed with deliberate casualness. "One day after the county denies my permit application, a decision your company happened to express support for at the agricultural board meeting, you arrive with dramatically increased offer and sudden recognition of work you previously dismissed." His composure slipped further, corporate confidence crumbling under the combined pressure of military presence and Sarah's unexpected directness. "Market conditions evolve rapidly, Mrs. Keller. Heartland simply wishes to ensure fair compensation reflecting current value assessment. Perhaps we could discuss details privately?" The last question directed pointed attention toward Major Chen, whose presence clearly disrupted whatever approach Tanner had planned. "Major Chen is here at my request as agricultural security consultant," Sarah replied, the technically accurate description bringing a subtle smile to the officer's otherwise professional expression. "Given recent security concerns surrounding agricultural intellectual property, I've engaged appropriate advisors to ensure proper protection of innovative methodologies developed on this property." The deliberately vague explanation had immediate impact on Tanner's demeanor, his expression shifting from confident corporate representative to something more calculating. "Mrs. Keller, Heartland has extensive legal resources to protect developmental agricultural systems. Perhaps your current advisors haven't fully explained the challenges individual operators face securing intellectual property rights when competing with established agricultural entities." The thinly veiled threat suggesting corporate legal machinery could appropriate her work regardless of her decisions crystallized Sarah's understanding of exactly what she faced: a powerful corporation recognizing value they intended to acquire by any means necessary, preferably by purchasing the entire property, but potentially through legal mechanisms if direct acquisition failed. "Thank you for your concern, Mr. Tanner. I'll certainly take Heartland's perspective under advisement while considering multiple partnership opportunities currently under discussion." Sarah rose from the table with newfound confidence, the implicit dismissal clear in her body language. "I appreciate your dramatically revised valuation of my failing farm. It's certainly enlightening how quickly perspectives can evolve." After Tanner's departure, observed carefully by security personnel until his vehicle left the property boundaries, Sarah returned to her kitchen where Colonel Harrington awaited with evident approval. "That was exceptionally well handled, Mrs. Keller. His response confirmed our assessment of Heartland's awareness regarding your soil amendment system's potential value." He never once asked about the military presence, Sarah noted, the omission striking her as significant. A normal person would have questioned why Air Force personnel and a military transport plane were at a private farm. He deliberately avoided acknowledging anything unusual. "Precisely," Major Chen confirmed. "That strategic avoidance suggests a prior awareness of potential government interest in your work, likely through their intelligence sources, monitoring our research priorities. His attempt to accelerate acquisition before formalized protection could be established indicates sophisticated understanding of exactly what you've developed. Colonel Harrington's tablet displayed new information, real-time updates from the research team's preliminary analysis. Mrs. Keller, initial field testing confirms what satellite imagery suggested. Your soil amendment system demonstrates microbial diversity and structural characteristics exceeding anything in our comparative database. The drought resistance mechanisms you've established through relatively simple methodology represent potential paradigm shift in climate adaptation approaches. The validation from sophisticated scientific analysis brought unexpected emotion. Her grandfather would have treasured this confirmation from advanced research facilities that his approach had merit beyond what conventional agricultural science had been willing to recognize. The county's dismissal of her permit application without serious review now appeared not merely bureaucratically negligent, but potentially influenced by corporate interests, recognizing value they preferred to control rather than see independently. Developed. The research partnership agreement includes immediate implementation of water management systems, rendering the county permit issue moot, Colonel Harrington continued, addressing practical concerns alongside broader implications. Federal research installations operate under different regulatory frameworks that essentially preempt local restrictions when national security applications are identified. Sarah considered the unfolding scenario with cautious optimism tempered by awareness of how drastically her life had changed in 24 hours. If I accept this partnership, what happens to my farm? I'm not interested in relocating to some government research facility. This land has been in Thomas's family for generations. The program specifically emphasizes on-site development within existing agricultural operations, Major Chen explained, her tone suggesting personal investment in this approach. Your farm would remain your property with expanded resources, becoming field research installation, demonstrating practical applications in working production environment. You would continue normal operations with additional support staff implementing broader research objectives while maintaining operational control. The approach represented almost exactly what Sarah would have designed herself. Continued farming operations, incorporating her soil amendment system with proper research support to expand and refine methodologies. Rather than corporate acquisition, burying her innovations within proprietary systems, this framework would develop applications specifically designed for implementation across diverse agricultural contexts. Colonel Harrington advanced to another screen showing implementation timeline and resource allocation. The first phase establishes baseline protection for your existing methodologies and provides immediate operational support securing this season's production. Subsequent phases expand research applications while developing distribution frameworks for broader implementation nationally. As Sarah reviewed the comprehensive proposal, the research team leader entered with barely contained excitement, approaching Colonel Harrington with tablet displaying preliminary analysis results. After brief consultation, the colonel turned to Sarah with heightened interest. Mrs. Keller, initial microbial analysis has identified several previously undocumented bacterial strains in your soil samples that appear to facilitate extraordinary moisture retention characteristics. This represents potentially groundbreaking discovery extending beyond even what we anticipated. The researcher, a woman in her 40s with the intense focus of someone accustomed to laboratory precision, addressed Sarah directly. Mrs. Keller, your fermentation methodology has cultivated microbial communities that establish symbiotic relationships with plant root systems in ways conventional agriculture deliberately disrupts through chemical interventions. You've essentially recreated and enhanced natural processes that industrial agriculture has systematically eliminated over decades of destructive practices. This validation from scientific expertise brought Sarah full circle to her grandfather's kitchen table, where he had patiently explained soil biology to his curious granddaughter decades earlier. "My grandfather called it feeding the soil, not the plant," she explained. He believed healthy soil microbiology naturally supported plant health rather than requiring constant chemical intervention. The agricultural industry dismissed his approach as unnecessarily complex compared to standardized chemical applications. The researcher nodded with evident understanding. The industrial agricultural model prioritized standardization and chemical control over biological complexity. Your grandfather understood what mainstream science is only now rediscovering, that soil health depends on microbial diversity, creating resilient ecosystems, rather than sterile growing medium depending on synthetic inputs. As the implications expanded through continued analysis, Sarah walked to the farmhouse porch, seeking momentary distance from the extraordinary developments transforming her quiet farm into a hive of research activity. From this vantage point, she could see the military transport plane still positioned in her eastern field. Research teams methodically documenting soil conditions throughout her property, and security personnel maintaining vigilant perimeter. Awareness, the contrast with yesterday morning's desolate outlook, seemed almost incomprehensible. Then she had faced imminent foreclosure following the county's permit denial, with Heartland's inadequate acquisition offer representing her only apparent option beyond financial collapse. Now, military researchers excitedly documented microbial communities she had cultivated through desperate innovation, identifying potential applications extending far beyond her immediate goal of farm survival. Major Chen joined her on the porch, respectfully allowing quiet contemplation before speaking. "Mrs. Keller, Colonel Harrington has received approval for emergency implementation order addressing your water management system. Engineering team can begin installation tomorrow if you accept the research partnership. The system design incorporates your original specifications with additional efficiency elements our hydraulic specialists identified." The reference to her rejected permit application, now superseded by federal research authorization, reminded Sarah of the county officials who had dismissed her approach without serious consideration. What happens when the county discovers military research installation operating on property they expected would be acquired by Heartland? After financial failure, they helped ensure through permit denial? A rare smile crossed Major Chen's professional demeanor. Federal research installations establish jurisdictional frameworks that significantly limit local interference options. The county will receive courtesy notification of change status. After implementation begins, their response options will be essentially ceremonial rather than substantive. This subtle revenge against bureaucratic dismissal brought unexpected satisfaction alongside the broader validation of approaches the county had rejected as unsubstantiated methodology. The officials, who hadn't bothered reviewing her detailed documentation, would soon discover military researchers had identified sufficient value to deploy immediate resources and jurisdictional authority supporting implementation. Colonel Harrington approached from the research area, tablet displaying formalized agreement awaiting final authorization. "Mrs. Keller, our analysis team has completed preliminary assessment confirming exceptional value in your soil amendment system. The partnership agreement has received expedited approval based on identified national security applications in agricultural climate adaptation. Your decision now determines immediate implementation timeline. Sarah looked across her struggling farm, land that had supported Thomas's family for generations through challenges ranging from Dust Bowl devastation to farm crisis foreclosures of the 1980s. Her improvised solutions, born from desperate necessity, had apparently rediscovered and enhanced biological wisdom that industrial agriculture had systematically eliminated through reductive chemical approaches. The validation represented not just personal vindication, but potential restoration of agricultural methodologies her grandfather had recognized as essential for sustainable food production. With newfound confidence balancing the surreal quality of military aircraft parked in her cornfield, Sarah signed the agreement that would transform Willow Creek Farm from struggling operation facing foreclosure to research installation, developing climate-adaptive agricultural methodologies for national implementation. The county's permit denial that had seemed her final defeat had instead triggered chain of events leading to extraordinary opportunity, benefiting not just her farm, but potentially agricultural systems nationwide. As research teams continued their methodical documentation and security personnel maintained protective perimeter, Sarah returned to her kitchen to retrieve her grandfather's original journals, the rejected wisdom that had guided her desperate innovations after Thomas's death. The yellowed pages containing careful observations and methodical development of principles industrial agriculture had dismissed as irrelevant would now inform federally supported research addressing climate adaptation challenges conventional approaches had proven inadequate to solve. "Your grandfather would be proud," Colonel Harrington observed, as Sarah carefully organized the journals for proper integration with modern research documentation. His vision extended beyond institutional limitations to fundamental principles. That time has proven essential rather than obsolete. The validation brought quiet satisfaction, transcending the bureaucratic dismissal and corporate manipulation that had nearly cost Sarah everything. The widow, who county officials had expected, would surrender to financial pressure after permit denial, would instead continue her family's agricultural legacy with expanded resources, developing methodologies with national security implications for food production in changing climate conditions. By sunset, as research teams completed initial documentation and prepared for expanded operations beginning the following day, Sarah stood at her kitchen window, watching the extraordinary activity. Transforming her quiet farm, the Air Force plane that had landed that morning represented not merely dramatic entrance, but profound validation of approaches conventional institutions had systematically dismissed until desperate circumstances forced innovative rediscovery. Of wisdom, conventional science had forgotten. 3 months after the military transport plane landed in her eastern field, Sarah Keller barely recognized Willow Creek Farm. The transformation had occurred with remarkable efficiency once the partnership agreement activated federal resources and jurisdictional authority. The struggling operation facing imminent foreclosure had evolved into a thriving research installation, combining practical agricultural production with advanced scientific investigation. The barn that had housed her improvised laboratory now adjoined, a state-of-the-art research facility, its modern architecture designed to complement rather than dominate the traditional farm structures. Solar panels installed on every suitable roof surface generated power exceeding the operation's needs, while the water management system, installed within days of the agreement signing, had rendered the county's permit denial irrelevant through sophisticated efficiency mechanisms that reduced consumption by 78% while improving distribution effectiveness. Sarah stood at the edge of her eastern field, watching the harvest team gather data alongside the corn crop that had defied both drought conditions and agricultural expectations. The plants, robust and productive despite minimal water inputs, represented visible validation of approaches conventional agriculture had dismissed as impractical. Researchers in earth-toned uniforms moved methodically through the rows, collecting samples and measurements with specialized equipment that transmitted real-time data to the research center's analytical systems. Protein content exceeding standard varieties by 22%, with 65% reduced water input, announced Dr. Elaine Montgomery, the biochemist who had joined the research team specifically to analyze the nutritional implications of Sarah's soil amendment system. The microbial communities you've established are facilitating nutrient uptake patterns that contradict established agricultural models. They're not just surviving drought conditions. They're actively thriving through biological mechanisms. Industrial agriculture deliberately suppresses. Sarah nodded, the scientific validation now familiar but still satisfying after years of dismissal by conventional agricultural authorities. My grandfather called it working with nature instead of against it. He believed plants and soil developed cooperative relationships over millennia that chemical agriculture disrupted for short-term yield gains while sacrificing long-term resilience. Dr. Montgomery's respect was evident as she reviewed the latest data on her tablet. Your grandfather was describing what we now call the soil microbiome, the complex ecological community comprising bacteria, fungi, and other microorganisms that interact with plant root systems. Industrial agriculture essentially sterilized this living system and replaced it with simplified chemical inputs that created dependency cycles requiring increasing intervention. The biochemist gestured toward the thriving cornfield. What you've accomplished here is essentially ecological restoration of agricultural systems, re-establishing balanced relationships between plants and soil microbiota that confer natural resilience against environmental stresses, including drought conditions. This technical articulation of principles her grandfather had explained in simpler terms brought Sarah full circle to childhood conversations at his kitchen table. The wisdom conventional science had once dismissed as outdated now received validation through sophisticated analytical methods, confirming exactly what he had understood through observation and traditional knowledge. Major Chen approached from the direction of the research facility, her formerly crisp uniform replaced by practical field attire more appropriate for agricultural operations. Over the past 3 months, she had transitioned from initial military contact to research coordination specialist, her organizational skills proving invaluable as the project expanded beyond initial expectations. Mrs. Keller, Colonel Harrington, will arrive within the hour for the quarterly assessment. The implementation data has exceeded projected benchmarks across all evaluation metrics. Her professional demeanor couldn't entirely conceal evident satisfaction with the program's success. The adaptation sites in Arizona and Oklahoma are reporting similar success with your soil amendment system modified for their specific regional conditions. This expansion beyond Willow Creek Farm represented significant evolution from Sarah's initial goal of simple farm survival. The soil amendment system she had developed through desperate necessity now supported agricultural operations in diverse climate zones, each implementation confirming adaptability beyond its original Nebraska context. The partnership agreement had established deployment protocols, ensuring her methodology benefited broader agricultural communities rather than becoming proprietary technology controlled by corporate interests. Sarah made her way toward the farmhouse, still her private residence despite the property's expanded operations. The wraparound porch that had once symbolized quiet rural isolation now served as informal meeting space where traditional agricultural wisdom and advanced scientific methodology found common ground through practical implementation. Her grandfather's original research journals occupied a custom-built display case in the living room, their yellowed pages now digitally preserved, while the physical documents remained protected for historical significance. The contrasts between her circumstances 3 months earlier and current reality remained occasionally startling. The county officials who had dismissed her permit application with barely concealed condescension now participated in carefully choreographed tours of the research installation, their public statements emphasizing cooperative relationships supporting agricultural innovation, despite having no meaningful input in operations protected by federal research authorization. Richard Tanner had been quietly reassigned by Heartland Agricultural Enterprises, his aggressive acquisition tactics replaced by corporate communications emphasizing collaborative approaches to sustainable agriculture that carefully avoided acknowledging their previous dismissal of methods they had secretly coveted. Most significant transformation, however, was the personal validation that transcended practical operations. Sarah's approach, born from desperate circumstance and guided by knowledge conventional institutions had rejected, now received confirmation through sophisticated scientific analysis, documenting exactly what her grandfather had understood through observation and traditional wisdom. The widow, who county officials had expected would surrender her farm to corporate acquisition after permit denial, instead directed research initiative establishing new paradigms for climate-adaptive agriculture. Colonel Harrington arrived precisely on schedule, his military precision now tempered by genuine enthusiasm for agricultural applications beyond his previous experience. The quarterly assessment had evolved from formal evaluation into collaborative strategic planning, as initial results exceeded even optimistic projections. Sarah joined him and the senior research team in the conference room adjoining the new laboratory facility, where data visualization systems displayed comprehensive analytics from both Willow Creek Farm and the expanding implementation sites nationwide. Production metrics from all test locations confirm consistent patterns of enhanced resilience across diverse climate conditions, reported Dr. Montgomery, gesturing toward comparison charts showing performance against conventional agricultural systems. Mrs. Keller's soil amendment methodology demonstrates remarkable adaptability to regional soil variations while maintaining core microbial relationship principles. The technical presentation continued with increasing details regarding soil structure, improvements, water retention characteristics, and nutritional density enhancements documented across implementation sites. The scientific terminology sometimes exceeded Sarah's formal training, but the underlying principles remained familiar from her grandfather's teachings. Healthy soil biology naturally supporting plant resilience rather than requiring constant chemical intervention. The economic analysis is particularly significant, added Dr. James Wilson, the agricultural economist who had joined the research team to assess implementation feasibility beyond controlled research environments. Initial establishment costs are offset by substantial reduction in irrigation requirements and eliminated chemical inputs, creating favorable return on investment metrics even before considering enhanced drought resilience and nutritional density improvements. This practical economic validation addressed critical implementation barriers beyond scientific confirmation. Farmers making operational decisions based on financial viability required demonstrable economic advantages alongside environmental benefits. The comprehensive analysis documented sustainable business models supporting transition from chemical-dependent methods to regenerative approaches without prohibitive conversion costs. Colonel Harrington reviewed the compiled data with evident satisfaction before addressing the gathered team. These results validate our initial assessment of Mrs. Keller's methodology as potentially transformative for agricultural resilience nationwide. The National Climate Adaptation Commission has requested comprehensive briefing regarding implementation, potential for drought-vulnerable agricultural regions as part of strategic food security planning. This elevation to national policy consideration represented extraordinary evolution from Sarah's desperate attempts to save her family farm. The Commission's interest confirmed recognition at highest governmental levels that her soil amendment system offered practical climate adaptation strategies transcending conventional approaches, proving increasingly inadequate as weather patterns became more extreme and unpredictable. Additionally, the Colonel continued with subtle smile, suggesting planned surprise, the Presidential Agriculture Innovation Award Committee has selected Willow Creek Farm as this year's recipient for pioneering climate-adaptive methodologies with demonstrated implementation success. The formal announcement will occur next week, though recipients are traditionally notified in advance. The unexpected recognition momentarily overwhelmed Sarah's composure. The prestigious award represented highest national acknowledgement for agricultural innovation, typically granted to institutional research teams or corporate agricultural divisions with substantial resources and formal scientific credentials. No individual farmer had received the honor in its 27-year history, much less a widow implementing desperate measures to save family property following county permit denial. "That's unexpected," she managed finally, the understated response drawing appreciative chuckles from the research team who had witnessed her practical focus on implementation rather than recognition throughout the project's development. "Perhaps unexpected but thoroughly deserved," Colonel Harrington replied. "The selection committee specifically cited your integration of traditional agricultural wisdom with modern scientific understanding to develop climate-adaptive methodologies accessible to diverse implementation contexts. The award acknowledges not just technical innovation, but philosophical framework, emphasizing regenerative approaches supporting long-term agricultural resilience. This validation of both technical methods and underlying philosophy represented complete reversal from institutional dismissal that had characterized responses to her grandfather's research decades earlier. The approaches conventional agriculture had rejected as unnecessarily complex compared to standardized chemical interventions now received presidential-level recognition as essential innovation addressing climate adaptation challenges chemical-dependent systems proved increasingly inadequate to address. As the meeting concluded with implementation timelines for expanding deployment regions, Sarah's attention was drawn to unexpected activity at the property entrance visible through the conference room windows. Two familiar county vehicles had arrived, the same official transportation that had delivered her permit denial notice 3 months earlier, with barely concealed satisfaction regarding her expected financial failure. Major Chen noticed her distraction and checked security notifications on her tablet. County Commissioner Davis and Agricultural Board Director Phillips requesting access for official county business. Security awaiting your authorization before granting property entrance. The officials who had dismissed her irrigation system proposal without serious consideration now sought access to the thriving research installation that federal authorization had established despite their opposition. The partnership agreement granted Sarah authority to approve or deny non-essential visitation requests, creating delicious irony regarding officials who had previously exercised permit authority over her farming operations. After brief consideration, Sarah authorized their access with specific routing to the administrative building rather than research facilities containing proprietary methodological implementations. The county officials who had expected to encounter a struggling widow facing foreclosure would instead meet the director of nationally recognized agricultural research initiative receiving Presidential Innovation Awards, a transition that warranted personal observation despite her transcendence. Of county jurisdictional relevance, Commissioner Davis and Director Phillips appeared visibly uncomfortable as they were escorted into the administrative building's conference room, their typically confident bureaucratic demeanor diminished by the sophisticated research installation that had materialized on property they had expected would transfer to corporate ownership following financial failure. Their permit denial had attempted to ensure. Mrs. Keller, Commissioner Davis began with forced professional courtesy that poorly masked evident discomfort, the county wished to personally deliver notification regarding reassessment of your previous irrigation permit application following departmental review procedures identifying potential processing irregularities. Sarah maintained neutral expression despite the transparent attempt at retroactive damage control. The county had clearly received advance notification regarding the forthcoming Presidential Innovation Award, triggering desperate effort to revise. Their official position before public announcement highlighted their dismissal of methodologies now receiving highest national recognition. The Agricultural Board has determined upon further review that your proposed system demonstrated innovative conservation characteristics, warranting specialized evaluation protocols outside standard assessment frameworks, added Director Phillips, carefully avoiding acknowledgement that this further review occurred only after federal research installation and presidential award selection rendered county approvals entirely irrelevant. With practiced bureaucratic flourish, Commissioner Davis presented official-looking documentation bearing county seals and signatures. We are pleased to provide this formal permit approval with commendation for water conservation methodology. The county fully supports innovative agricultural approaches, enhancing sustainability metrics within our jurisdictional responsibility. The I permit approval, arriving 3 months after federal research authorization had superseded county jurisdictional authority, represented pathetic attempt at historical revision rather than meaningful administrative action. The officials who had specifically cited unsubstantiated methodology in their denial documentation now claimed support for approaches they had dismissed without serious consideration until presidential recognition forced desperate repositioning. "Your timing is impeccable," Sarah observed with deliberate neutrality that nonetheless carried unmistakable subtext for anyone with functioning self-awareness. "I'll ensure this documentation is appropriately filed with our administrative records. The Research Division appreciates county acknowledgement of innovative methodologies enhancing agricultural sustainability." The subtle emphasis on Research Division highlighted transformed power dynamics from vulnerable farmer subject to county permit authority to director of federally authorized installation, outside local jurisdictional control. The officials who had expected their permit denial would force her property sale to corporate interests now sought favorable association with presidential award recipient, implementing methodologies they had specifically rejected. After their departure, hurried and uncomfortable once they realized no photo opportunities or public statements would be accommodated during their visit. Sarah allowed herself moment of satisfaction regarding their transparent attempt at historical revision. The county that had dismissed her approaches without serious consideration now desperately sought association with nationally recognized innovation they had specifically rejected through permit denial that had nearly cost her everything. Their performance lacked subtlety, but demonstrated appropriate recognition of changed circumstances, observed Major Chen, who had witnessed the interaction with professional detachment masking evident amusement. The official record now contains their formal acknowledgement of methodological validity they previously rejected, creating useful documentation should historical questions arise regarding their initial assessment. This diplomatic characterization of bureaucratic self-preservation brought genuine laughter, a sound that had been rare at Willow Creek Farm during the difficult months following Thomas's death, but had become increasingly common as the research initiative validated approaches county officials had dismissed and corporate interests had attempted to acquire through manipulative pressure rather than legitimate recognition. As evening approached, Sarah walked her property perimeter alone, observing transformation that extended beyond physical facilities. To fundamental vitality evident throughout ecological systems, she had nurtured back toward natural resilience. The soil that industrial agriculture had reduced to depleted medium dependent on chemical inputs now teemed with biological activity, supporting plant health through cooperative relationships rather than artificial interventions. The crops that conventional experts had insisted required standardized chemical regimens demonstrated robust productivity through regenerative methodologies, working with natural systems rather than imposing artificial control mechanisms. The contrast with conditions following the county's permit, denial reflected comprehensive validation of approaches her grandfather had recognized as essential long before institutional science acknowledged their validity. The struggling Widow County officials had expected would surrender to financial pressure following their permit denial. Instead, directed nationally recognized research initiative implementing methodology that corporate interests had attempted to acquire through manipulative tactics once they recognized value, conventional assessment had dismissed. The following week brought formal announcement of the Presidential Agriculture Innovation Award, triggering media attention that transformed Sarah's personal validation into public narrative inspiring agricultural communities nationwide. The press release specifically highlighted integration of traditional agricultural wisdom with modern scientific understanding, developing climate-adaptive methodologies accessible to diverse implementation contexts, language that honored both her grandfather's rejected research and her practical implementation, born from desperate necessity. The official ceremony at the White House represented surreal culmination of journey that had begun with county permit denial threatening her family. Farm's survival. Sarah stood at the podium, following presidential introduction, facing assembled dignitaries and media representatives with the practical composure that had characterized her approach throughout extraordinary transition from struggling widow to recognized agricultural innovator. This recognition honors wisdom that institutional science once rejected, but changing climate conditions have rendered essential, she began, her straightforward delivery contrasting with typical ceremonial rhetoric characterizing such events. My grandfather understood that healthy soil naturally supports plant resilience through biological relationships, industrial agriculture deliberately disrupted through chemical interventions, prioritizing standardization over sustainability. She acknowledged the research team that had helped transform her improvised methods into scientifically validated methodology, particularly highlighting Major Chen and Colonel Harrington, whose recognition of potential value had initiated federal partnership preventing corporate acquisition that would have restricted implementation to proprietary applications rather than broader agricultural benefit. This award represents validation of approaches conventional agriculture dismissed as unnecessarily complex compared to standardized chemical interventions. She continued with subtle reference to institutional rejection that had characterized responses to her grandfather's research. As climate change intensifies agricultural challenges worldwide, we're rediscovering that working with natural systems rather than imposing artificial control mechanisms creates resilience conventional approaches increasingly fail to provide. The ceremony concluded with announcement of expanded implementation initiative supporting farmers nationwide transitioning from chemical-dependent methods to regenerative approaches based on Sarah's methodology. The comprehensive program included technical support systems, implementation subsidies, and transition protocols, addressing practical barriers that had previously limited adoption despite growing recognition of conventional agriculture's increasing vulnerability to changing climate conditions. Returning to Willow Creek Farm following the Washington ceremonies, Sarah found personal satisfaction transcending official recognition or expanded implementation. The struggling farm that had faced foreclosure following county permit denial now demonstrated thriving vitality through methods conventional agriculture had dismissed until desperate circumstances forced innovative rediscovery of wisdom institutional science had forgotten. The widow who county officials had expected would surrender to financial pressure instead pioneered nationally recognized methodology addressing agricultural challenges conventional approaches proved increasingly inadequate to solve. 6 months after the military transport plane landed in her eastern field, Sarah hosted the first regenerative agriculture training program at Willow Creek Farm, where farmers from drought-affected regions nationwide gathered to learn practical implementation of soil amendment systems adapted to their specific regional conditions. The participants represented diverse agricultural operations united by recognition that conventional chemical-dependent methods faced increasing vulnerability to climate volatility, requiring fundamentally different approaches rather than intensified conventional interventions. The transition requires changing both practices and perspective, Sarah explained to the gathered farmers during orientation session held on her front porch, the same space where she had received her permit denial notice that had seemingly represented final defeat before triggering extraordinary chain of events leading to national implementation initiative. We're not simply replacing synthetic inputs with organic alternatives, but restoring biological relationships, industrial agriculture, systematically eliminated through reductive approaches, prioritizing standardization over resilience. The practical farmers, initially skeptical but increasingly engaged as field demonstrations confirmed production viability, represented exactly the implementation audience Sarah had prioritized throughout the project's development. The partnership agreement had specifically established deployment protocols, ensuring her methodology remained accessible to working agricultural operations, rather than becoming expensive proprietary technology controlled by corporate interests serving wealthy operations exclusively. Dr. Montgomery provided scientific explanation supporting Sarah's practical guidance, translating complex biological principles into operational frameworks farmers could implement without specialized technical background. The soil amendment system essentially jumpstarts microbial communities that chemical agriculture has suppressed, re-establishing balanced relationships between plants and soil biology that naturally support resilience against environmental stresses including drought conditions. The training program's practical approach reflected Sarah's insistence that implementation remain accessible to diverse agricultural contexts rather than requiring prohibitive investment or technical expertise. The methodology that had begun as desperate attempt to save her family farm following Thomas's death now supported nationwide implementation, addressing climate adaptation challenges conventional approaches increasingly failed to solve. As the training participants conducted field exercises implementing core methodologies adapted to their specific regional requirements, Sarah observed from the edge of the demonstration plot the satisfaction transcending personal validation. To encompass broader transformation, her grandfather had envisioned decades before institutional science acknowledged its validity. The county's permit denial that had threatened everything she valued had instead triggered extraordinary chain of events leading to national implementation of approaches conventional agriculture had dismissed until changing climate conditions rendered alternative methodologies essential rather than optional. Colonel Harrington joined her. The military precision that had characterized their initial interaction, now balanced by genuine appreciation for agricultural systems beyond his previous experience. The Defense Department just approved expanded international implementation through agricultural security partnerships addressing climate vulnerability in key strategic regions. Your methodology has been classified as critical infrastructure technology supporting food security resilience in volatile climate conditions. This international expansion represented extraordinary evolution from Sarah's initial goal of saving her family farm through desperate innovation. The soil amendment system developed in her barn from necessity and guided by her grandfather's rejected research now supported agricultural resilience worldwide. Its demonstrated effectiveness transcending institutional barriers that had previously limited implementation, despite growing recognition of conventional agriculture's increasing vulnerability to climate volatility. We've identified implementation sites across 4 continents, demonstrating diverse climate vulnerability characteristics, Colonel Harrington continued, displaying global distribution map on his tablet. Each location represents agricultural region facing severe adaptation challenges conventional approaches have failed to address effectively. Your methodology will support transition to regenerative systems, enhancing resilience through biological relationships rather than chemical dependencies. The Global Implementation Initiative completed journey from local permit denial to international adaptation strategy, comprehensive validation of approaches conventional agriculture had dismissed as irrelevant until changing climate conditions forced recognition that chemical-dependent methods created fundamental vulnerability intensified. Technological intervention couldn't resolve. The methodology county officials had rejected through permit denial, threatening her farm's survival, now supported agricultural resilience worldwide through principles her grandfather had recognized decades before institutional science acknowledged their validity. 1 year after the Air Force plane landed in her eastern field, Sarah stood at the edge of her property, surveying transformation that extended beyond physical facilities to fundamental philosophical validation. The struggling widow who county officials had expected would surrender to financial pressure following permit denial, instead directed internationally implemented research initiative, establishing new paradigms for climate-adaptive agriculture based on principles conventional institutions had systematically rejected until desperate circumstances forced innovative rediscovery of wisdom modern science had forgotten. The county's permit denial, delivered with barely concealed satisfaction regarding her expected financial failure, had instead triggered extraordinary chain of events, transforming not just Willow Creek Farm, but agricultural methodology nationwide. The desperate widow facing foreclosure had become Presidential Innovation Award recipient, directing global implementation initiative based on approaches conventional agriculture had dismissed until changing climate conditions rendered alternative methodologies essential rather than optional. Sarah placed her grandfather's original journal on the porch railing, its yellowed pages containing wisdom institutional science had once rejected, but changing environmental conditions had rendered increasingly valid. His understanding that healthy soil naturally supported plant resilience through biological relationships, industrial agriculture deliberately disrupted, now received comprehensive validation through sophisticated scientific analysis confirming exactly what he had recognized. through observation and traditional knowledge decades before formal science acknowledged its legitimacy. The contrast between her circumstances following permit denial and current reality represented more than personal vindication or professional validation. It demonstrated fundamental reassessment of agricultural approaches as climate change intensified. Environmental challenges, conventional methods proved increasingly inadequate to address. The methodology county officials had dismissed without serious consideration now supported international implementation, addressing food security challenges worldwide through principles her grandfather had understood long before institutional science recognized their essential validity. As new research team members arrived for expanded implementation programs, Sarah reflected on journey that had begun with desperate attempt to save her family farm following Thomas's death and county permit denial threatening everything she valued. The transformation from struggling widow to recognized agricultural innovator directing presidential award-winning research initiative represented extraordinary validation of approaches conventional agriculture had systematically dismissed until changing environmental conditions forced recognition that chemical-dependent methods created fundamental vulnerabilities technological intervention alone couldn't resolve. The widow denied permit by county officials expected to surrender her family farm to corporate acquisition had instead pioneered internationally implemented methodology addressing agricultural challenges conventional approaches increasingly failed to meet effectively. What began as desperate innovation following personal tragedy had evolved into comprehensive validation of principles her grandfather had recognized decades before. Institutional science acknowledged their validity, principles now supporting agricultural resilience worldwide through implementation initiative triggered by county permit denial that had threatened everything before initiating extraordinary chain of events, transforming not just Willow Creek Farm, but agricultural methodology worldwide. 5 years after the military transport plane landed in her eastern field, Sarah Keller sat on the farmhouse porch, watching the sunset paint the Nebraska sky in spectacular hues of orange and purple. The rocking chair, Thomas's favorite spot, in the evenings after long days of fieldwork, had become her customary place for reflection as day transitioned to night. So much had changed since that desperate morning when county officials had delivered her permit denial with barely concealed satisfaction regarding her expected failure. Willow Creek Farm had transformed from struggling operation facing foreclosure to international research headquarters for climate-adaptive agricultural methodology. The modest property that county officials had expected would be sold to corporate interests following financial collapse, now hosted visitors from 6 continents seeking knowledge about regenerative approaches increasingly essential as climate volatility intensified worldwide. The original soil amendment system she had developed in her barn from desperate necessity had evolved through scientific refinement into comprehensive agricultural methodology implemented across 47 countries. What began as improvised attempt to extend limited resources following Thomas's death now supported food security initiatives addressing climate challenges conventional agriculture increasingly failed to meet effectively. The Australian implementation data just arrived, announced Dr. Montgomery, emerging from the research facility that had expanded 3 times since its initial construction. Drought resistance metrics exceed even our optimistic projections. The modified methodology is showing 83% productivity maintenance, despite 60% reduced rainfall compared to historical averages. This international validation represented extraordinary evolution from Sarah's initial goal of simple farm survival. The approaching implementation specialist, now a close friend and trusted colleague, embodied the integration of scientific, expertise with practical agricultural knowledge that characterize the program's successful approach worldwide. The indigenous knowledge integration protocols you insisted on have proven particularly valuable in the Australian context. Dr. Montgomery continued, settling into the adjacent rocking chair with the comfortable familiarity of countless evening discussions. The Aboriginal land management principles regarding seasonal burning cycles have enhanced soil microbiome recovery metrics beyond standard implementation results. This acknowledgement of traditional wisdom's value, alongside scientific methodology, reflected core philosophical approach Sarah had maintained throughout the program's expansion, recognizing that indigenous agricultural knowledge often contained sophisticated understanding of ecological relationships conventional science had systematically dismissed until changing environmental conditions forced reassessment of agricultural fundamentals. My grandfather always said we should listen to people who've successfully managed land for thousands of years, instead of chemical companies selling products for decades, Sarah replied, the simple wisdom still guiding implementation approaches. Despite the program's increasingly sophisticated scientific framework, traditional knowledge often addresses resilience principles modern agriculture sacrificed for standardization and short-term productivity. From the driveway came the sound of approaching vehicles, the evening's scheduled arrival bringing participants for tomorrow's International Agricultural Adaptation Symposium being hosted at Willow Creek Farm. The annual gathering had become premier global event for climate-resilient agricultural methodology, attracting participants ranging from subsistence farmers implementing basic techniques with minimal resources to sophisticated research scientists developing advanced applications for diverse ecological contexts. Sarah watched as convoy of shuttle vans delivered attendees from airport, delegates from 37 countries representing agricultural systems facing diverse climate challenges requiring fundamentally different approaches than conventional methodologies increasingly failed to provide. The visitors' expressions as they first encountered Willow Creek Farm inevitably reflected same mix of surprise and admiration, the modest property's unassuming appearance belying its outsized influence on international agricultural methodology. Major Chen, now Dr. Chen following her transition from military service to civilian research leadership, coordinated the arrival operations with characteristic efficiency. Her permanent relocation to the research installation 3 years earlier had represented significant professional recalibration, exchanging military advancement for direct involvement with agricultural implementation she considered essential infrastructure for climate security. Delegates from the African consortium arrived safely despite weather delays, she reported, joining Sarah and Dr. Montgomery on the porch as the symposium participants were directed to appropriate accommodations. Their regional drought adaptation results have exceeded implementation projections by significant margins. The consortium chairman specifically requested private consultation regarding expanded methodology transfer protocols for West African implementation. The African development represented particular satisfaction for Sarah, whose partnership agreement had specifically established accessibility requirements, ensuring her methodologies supported agricultural communities with limited resources rather than becoming proprietary technology available only to wealthy operations. The consortium's success implementing modified approaches adapted to specific regional conditions validated core philosophical principle guiding the program from its inception, that climate-resilient agriculture required accessible methodologies, supporting diverse implementation contexts rather than standardized solutions requiring prohibitive investment. Colonel Harrington, now approaching retirement but still directly involved with strategic program development, arrived separately, his driver navigating the familiar route to the farmhouse with practiced precision. The military precision that had characterized their initial interaction had mellowed over 5 years of collaboration, though his fundamental effectiveness remained unchanged, despite the transition from emergency intervention to established program administration. The United Nations Food Security Council formally adopted your methodology as primary climate adaptation strategy for vulnerable agricultural regions, he announced without preamble, his satisfaction evident despite characteristically straightforward delivery. Implementation funding has been approved through international cooperation mechanisms, supporting transitional agriculture in regions facing immediate climate disruption. This international policy adoption represented comprehensive validation of approach county officials had dismissed without serious consideration 5 years earlier. The permit denial that had threatened Sarah's farm with foreclosure had instead triggered extraordinary chain of events leading to United Nations implementation of methodology addressing global food security challenges intensified by climate volatility that conventional approaches increasingly failed to mitigate effectively. As evening deepened into night, informal gathering assembled on Sarah's expanded porch. Research leaders, implementation specialists, and key program administrators engaged in wide-ranging discussion regarding next development phases. The conversation reflected integration of scientific innovation with practical agricultural wisdom that had characterized the program's approach from its inception, balancing sophisticated analytical methodology with fundamental understanding of ecological relationships industrial agriculture had systematically disrupted. The corporate adoption metrics show interesting pattern, noted Dr. Wilson, the agricultural economist, whose initial economic analysis had helped overcome implementation barriers beyond scientific validation. Major agribusiness corporations that initially dismissed regenerative approaches as economically impractical are now establishing sustainability divisions, implementing methodology remarkably similar to our core protocols while carefully avoiding direct attribution. This corporate recalibration represented particularly ironic validation given Heartland Agricultural Enterprises' early manipulation attempts following recognition of Sarah's methodology's potential value. The corporation that had supported county permit denial while simultaneously pursuing acquisition of her property through financial pressure, now promoted innovative sustainability initiatives, implementing principles remarkably similar to approaches they had previously dismissed as impractical compared to chemical-intensive methods they had aggressively marketed. Imitation remains sincerest form of flattery, Sarah observed, with subtle satisfaction, transcending mere vindication regarding entities that had once threatened everything she valued. Their implementation expands regenerative methodologies reach regardless of attribution concerns. The soil doesn't care who gets credit for restoring its biological functions. This philosophical perspective, prioritizing practical implementation over institutional recognition, reflected core values that had guided the program's development throughout extraordinary transition from desperate farm-saving measures to international methodology implementation. Sarah had consistently emphasized accessible application over proprietary control, supporting widespread adoption rather than restricted implementation, serving narrow institutional interests. Tomorrow's symposium features unprecedented participation diversity, noted Dr. Chen, reviewing attendance demographics on her tablet. 58% of delegates represent working agricultural operations directly implementing methodology, while technical specialists comprise only 27% of participants. The balance between practical application and scientific development reflects program philosophy, emphasizing implementation accessibility over theoretical complexity. This implementation balance represented fulfillment of Sarah's insistence that the program maintain practical agricultural focus rather than evolving into purely academic research initiative disconnected from working farming operations. The methodology that had begun as desperate attempt to save her family farm now supported diverse agricultural systems worldwide, precisely because implementation remained accessible to practitioners without specialized scientific expertise or prohibitive resource requirements. As symposium preparations concluded for the evening, Sarah remained on the porch alone, reflecting on journey that had transformed her life alongside agricultural methodology now implemented worldwide. The desperate widow facing foreclosure following county permit denial had become internationally recognized agricultural innovator, directing climate adaptation initiatives, supporting food security challenges intensified by environmental volatility that conventional approaches increasingly failed to address effectively. Morning brought systematic activity as the symposium commenced in the conference center, constructed adjacent to the original farm buildings. The architectural design deliberately integrating traditional agricultural structures with modern research facilities while maintaining aesthetic balance, honoring the property's farming heritage. Delegates from 6 continents gathered in the central meeting space, their diverse backgrounds unified by shared recognition that conventional agricultural methods faced fundamental limitations, addressing climate challenges, requiring fundamentally different approaches. Sarah delivered opening remarks with characteristic straightforward delivery that had become her trademark in international agricultural forums. 5 years ago, county officials denied water management permit for this farm, citing unsubstantiated methodology regarding approaches now implemented across 47 countries, addressing climate adaptation challenges conventional agriculture increasingly fails to meet effectively. The reference to initial institutional rejection created appreciative response from assembled delegates, familiar with her journey from struggling widow to international implementation director. The transparent contrast between early dismissal and subsequent validation represented inspirational narrative transcending personal vindication to emphasize fundamental reassessment of agricultural approaches as environmental conditions rendered conventional methods increasingly inadequate. This symposium represents more than scientific validation or implementation success, she continued, her practical perspective grounding technical discussions in fundamental agricultural purpose. It demonstrates essential reconnection between agricultural methodology and ecological relationships. Industrial approaches systematically disrupted through prioritizing standardization over sustainability. We're not creating new innovations, but rediscovering wisdom, conventional agriculture, deliberately abandoned for short-term productivity gains with long-term resilience costs. The symposium proceedings reflected this integration of scientific methodology with practical agricultural application. Technical presentations balanced by implementation case studies demonstrating real-world application across diverse environmental contexts. The discussion sessions particularly emphasized knowledge exchange between traditional agricultural communities and scientific researchers, recognizing complementary contributions from different knowledge systems, addressing common challenges through diverse perspectives. During midday break, Sarah encountered unexpected visitor whose presence created momentary surprise given historical context. Richard Tanner, Heartland Agricultural Enterprises' former acquisition manager, who had aggressively pursued her property while dismissing her farming approaches, stood awkwardly near the refreshment area, his corporate confidence replaced by evident discomfort in an environment where his previous manipulation tactics were well-documented components of the program's origin story. "Mrs. Keller," he began with careful formality, suggesting rehearsed approach. I've joined Agri-Evolve Consultancy, focusing on sustainable transition strategies for conventional operations facing climate adaptation challenges. Your symposium represents unparalleled knowledge resource regarding implementation methodologies our clients increasingly recognize as essential rather than optional. The corporate representative who had once told Sarah she was fighting losing battle against nature, economics and progress while offering insulting acquisition price for her farm now sought professional association with methodologies he had specifically dismissed as impractical compared to chemical-intensive approaches he had aggressively marketed. The irony wasn't lost on either participant in this uncomfortable reunion, though Sarah maintained professional composure despite justifiable satisfaction regarding this dramatic perspective reversal. The implementation workshops might prove particularly valuable for your clients, she suggested, with practical focus transcending personal history. They specifically address transition challenges for operations, converting from chemical-dependent methods to regenerative approaches, while maintaining operational viability throughout methodology transfer process. Her professional response? Prioritizing practical implementation over personal vindication, reflected consistent values guiding the program throughout its development. The methodology that had begun as desperate attempt to save her family farm, following Thomas's death, supported diverse agricultural systems worldwide, precisely because Sarah had emphasized accessible application over restricted implementation, serving narrow institutional interests. As the symposium continued through afternoon sessions, Sarah observed interactions between diverse participants with satisfaction transcending scientific validation or professional recognition. The subsistence farmers from climate-vulnerable regions engaging directly with advanced research scientists, the indigenous agricultural practitioners sharing traditional knowledge with technical specialists developing implementation protocols. The policy administrators learning practical application challenges from working agricultural operations, implementing methodology with limited resources. This knowledge integration across typical institutional boundaries represented fulfillment of implementation philosophy Sarah had maintained, despite occasional pressure toward conventional research model, prioritizing academic publication over practical application. The methodology that had saved her farm from foreclosure now supported agricultural operations worldwide, precisely because implementation remained accessible to diverse practitioners rather than becoming specialized technology requiring prohibitive expertise or resources. The symposium's evening reception, held in the original barn now carefully preserved as historical exhibit documenting the program's origins, brought moment of reflection as Sarah addressed gathered delegates in space where her improvised laboratory had once occupied half the available area. The contrast between desperate circumstances following permit denial and current international implementation initiative created powerful narrative inspiring agricultural communities worldwide facing similar institutional dismissal regarding approaches conventional authorities deemed impractical until changing conditions forced fundamental reassessment. This barn represents more than historical curiosity or program origin documentation, she explained to assembled delegates regarding space, where her soil amendment system had first developed from desperate necessity. It demonstrates that innovation often emerges from practical problem-solving rather than theoretical research, from farmers addressing immediate challenges with available resources, rather than institutions developing standardized solutions requiring specialized implementation. Contexts. The delegates, many from agricultural communities facing climate challenges similar to those that had threatened Willow Creek Farm, found particular inspiration in transformation from struggling operation facing foreclosure to International Methodology Development Center. The narrative transcended scientific validation or technological innovation to emphasize fundamental reassessment of agricultural approaches as environmental conditions rendered conventional methods increasingly inadequate addressing climate. A volatility intensifying worldwide. As symposium activities concluded for the evening, Sarah found quiet moment alone in the barn where everything had begun 5 years earlier. The space had been carefully preserved in its original condition. Her grandfather's journals protected in climate-controlled display cases, the improvised fermentation vessels maintained as historical artifacts, the handwritten documentation, protecting implementation continuity should digital systems ever fail. The humble origin point had become almost sacred space for program participants, recognizing that international methodology addressing climate challenges worldwide had begun as desperate widow's attempt to save family farm following husband's death and county permit denial threatening everything she valued. Colonel Harrington joined her, his approaching retirement lending reflective quality to their conversation that military precision had initially precluded. When that transport plane landed 5 years ago, I expected significant agricultural innovation, but couldn't have anticipated international implementation transformation. Your insistence on maintaining practical accessibility while incorporating scientific validation created implementation success institutional approaches repeatedly failed to achieve. This acknowledgement from military leader whose career had focused on technological sophistication rather than traditional methodology represented particular validation regarding Sarah's consistent emphasis on practical implementation over theoretical complexity. The approach county officials had dismissed without serious consideration now supported agricultural resilience worldwide, precisely because implementation remained accessible to practitioners without specialized expertise or prohibitive resource requirements. The methodology transfer protocols you established have proven particularly effective addressing institutional barriers conventional agriculture erected against alternative approaches, Harrington continued, referencing implementation framework. Sarah had designed specifically to overcome resistance from agricultural authorities invested in chemical-dependent methods. The accessibility requirements prevented corporate interests from restricting implementation through proprietary control mechanisms that would have limited application to wealthy operations while excluding vulnerable agricultural communities. This implementation accessibility represented fulfillment of Sarah's grandfather's vision regarding agricultural methodology, serving broader community benefit rather than narrow institutional interests. The approaches conventional agriculture had dismissed as unnecessarily complex compared to standardized chemical interventions, now supported diverse implementation contexts worldwide, precisely because Sarah had maintained core philosophical principles guiding development toward accessible application rather than restricted control. The following morning brought symposium's culminating session, the announcement of Regenerative Agricultural Implementation Initiative, expanding Sarah's methodology to 70 additional countries through United Nations Climate Adaptation Program, addressing food security challenges intensified by environmental volatility. The comprehensive implementation framework incorporated 5 years of refinement across diverse agricultural contexts, while maintaining accessibility requirements, ensuring the methodology supported vulnerable agricultural communities rather than becoming proprietary technology, serving wealthy operations exclusively. As Sarah addressed assembled delegates regarding expanded implementation initiative, the contrast with circumstances following county permit denial created powerful narrative inspiring agricultural communities worldwide. The struggling widow, county officials had expected would surrender to financial pressure, had instead pioneered methodology, addressing climate challenges, conventional approaches increasingly failed to meet effectively. The permit denial that had threatened everything she valued had instead triggered extraordinary chain of events, transforming not just Willow Creek Farm, but agricultural methodology worldwide. This implementation expansion represents validation of approaches conventional agriculture systematically dismissed until changing environmental conditions forced fundamental reassessment, she explained to assembled delegates representing agricultural systems facing diverse climate challenges. The methodology that began as a desperate attempt to save one family farm now supports food security worldwide through principles my grandfather understood decades before. Institutional science acknowledged their validity. Following symposium conclusion and delegates' departure, Sarah returned to evening ritual, watching sunset from farmhouse porch Thomas had particularly valued after long days of fieldwork. The satisfaction transcended scientific validation or professional recognition to encompass broader transformation, agricultural methodology worldwide. Addressing challenges, conventional approaches increasingly failed to meet effectively as climate volatility intensified global food security concerns. Major transformation milestones lined the journey from desperate widow facing foreclosure to international implementation director. The county's permit denial that had threatened everything she valued. The military plane landing unexpectedly in her eastern field. The research partnership validation of approaches conventional agriculture had dismissed. The Presidential Innovation Award acknowledging methodology addressing climate challenges nationwide. The United Nations Implementation Initiative supporting agricultural communities worldwide. Yet most significant validation transcended institutional recognition or implementation statistics to encompass fundamental philosophical principle her grandfather had maintained throughout professional rejection that had characterized responses to his research. Healthy soil naturally supported plant resilience through biological relationships. Industrial agriculture had deliberately disrupted through chemical interventions, prioritizing standardization over sustainability. The wisdom conventional science had dismissed as outdated, now received comprehensive validation through sophisticated analytical methods, confirming exactly what he had understood through observation and traditional knowledge. 10 years after the Air Force transport plane landed in her eastern field, Sarah hosted 50th session of Regenerative Agriculture Training Program at Willow Creek Farm, where farmers from climate-vulnerable regions worldwide gathered to learn. Practical implementation adapted to their specific regional conditions. The participants represented diverse agricultural contexts, united by recognition that conventional methods faced increasing inadequacy, addressing environmental challenges requiring fundamentally different approaches rather than intensified conventional interventions. The struggling widow who county officials had expected would surrender to financial pressure following permit denial had instead pioneered methodology implemented across 87 countries. Addressing climate challenges, conventional agriculture increasingly failed to meet effectively. What began as a desperate attempt to save family farm following husband's death had evolved into comprehensive validation of principles her grandfather had recognized decades before. Institutional science acknowledged their validity. Principles, now supporting agricultural resilience worldwide through implementation initiative triggered by county permit denial that had threatened everything before initiating extraordinary chain of events, transforming not just Willow Creek Farm, but agricultural methodology worldwide. As new training participants gathered on expanded porch that had once hosted Sarah's solitary contemplation following permit denial threatening her farm's survival, she reflected on journey that had begun with desperate innovation following personal tragedy and evolved into international methodology supporting food security worldwide. The transformation from struggling widow to recognized agricultural innovator directing global implementation initiative represented extraordinary validation of approaches conventional agriculture had systematically dismissed until changing environmental conditions forced recognition that chemical-dependent methods created fundamental vulnerabilities technological intervention alone couldn't resolve. The county officials who had delivered permit denial with barely concealed satisfaction regarding her expected failure had long since retired, their official positions now occupied by administrators who highlighted the county's historic contribution to agricultural innovation without acknowledging institutional rejection that had nearly destroyed everything before triggering extraordinary chain of events leading to methodology now implemented worldwide. The corporate representatives who had dismissed her farming approach while secretly recognizing its potential value now promoted sustainable initiatives implementing remarkably similar principles while carefully avoiding attribution regarding original methodology development. These institutional revisions, attempting to align historical positions with subsequently validated approaches, created occasional amusement but minimal concern for Sarah, whose focus remained practical implementation rather than institutional recognition. The methodology that had saved her farm from foreclosure now supported agricultural operations worldwide because she had consistently prioritized accessible application over restricted implementation, serving narrow institutional interests, maintaining philosophical principles her grandfather had embodied throughout professional rejection that had characterized responses to his research until changing environmental conditions forced fundamental reassessment of agricultural approaches as conventional. Methods proved increasingly inadequate, addressing climate challenges intensifying worldwide. The widow, denied permit by county officials, expected to surrender her family farm to corporate acquisition, had instead pioneered internationally implemented methodology, addressing agricultural challenges conventional approaches increasingly failed to meet effectively. What began as desperate innovation following personal tragedy had evolved into comprehensive validation of principles her grandfather had recognized decades before. Institutional science acknowledged their validity, principles now supporting agricultural resilience worldwide through implementation initiative, beginning with county permit denial that had threatened everything before, initiating extraordinary chain of events, transforming not just Willow Creek Farm, but agricultural methodology worldwide. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.